Again in studio, this time about coding, but also how coding would look like 20 years ago. Of course, it's not easy to imagine 1980, but also the physical appearance of people in that time. Actually, of course, fashion of those beings in that time was not simple, and also in modern time, people might see them as difficult category. To understand social status of the richest is not easy if we see them 20 years ago, and of course also together with currency in that time. The development in 1980 was extremely difficult, especially for different forms of the female in society with lower status or lower human beings, but also very important to understand different forms of the degrees and different forms of the dangers for different forms of the humans. To understand simple forms of the skins, you can also understand better products for those skins. To understand different forms of variations that come together with the core and of course with the code, it becomes extremely complex, especially in more modern time if you limit all the female so they should not code in your structure or organization. To understand simple forms, but also evolution of any forms of metaprogramming, it becomes very, very difficult. But also to understand simple forms of evolution from 1980 till today. To understand the concurrency, you might need to look back for 5 years or even to understand the process of some other startings. Not too much manipulating, but only making limits for your company and what female can do in your company, especially when it comes to physical experience or what humans can experience in your company. To understand simple forms of the hair texture, but also different forms of the hair color, also simple forms of the body, but also trends in different forms of the sweats, or whatever it might be in a face. Of course, also different forms of the jewelry. To understand different forms of the jewel is very important, but also to understand different forms of the core, but also converting to more simple and more simple versions. To understand the messaging together with happy forums, it becomes extremely difficult, especially if female usually abuse the code when it comes to different forms of manipulation with love. To understand better forms and how to run the code correctly, probably you should not run it, but actually to be a little bit silly with ethics when you are building the ethics for the women's. To understand modern time, we need to look back in 1980 and how some simple forms were made. To understand safety, of course, also different forms of algorithms together with fashion industry or even clothing. To understand more official fashion or even different forms of the players together with the technology. What the technology was in 1980, of course, we could not know for sure, but probably some earlier version of Linux already existed. But of course, if that didn't exist, there were the algorithms terms about the fashion. It's not so simple to understand 1980, but also different forms of dependency together with different forms of the people in 1980. If you are building the company, but also together with jewelry for women, of course, that might be extremely difficult, but also very paranormal for some women to understand different forms of variable materials together with the homeowners. Of course, it's also mentioned in a book me made, but in book people do not have any nose. They also do not smell anything, and of course, some do not hear anything. Fiction in book is very important also to understand archaeology, but also the psychology in archaeology and different forms of the culture together with different forms of the necklace in the history or a million years ago. To understand different forms of the museums is also important, but also not to abuse those ethics, but to build proper coding clothing for female. To understand interface, it's very, very difficult, but also to understand different forms of the fashion together with Java or JavaScripts, to understand platforms or how they would look in 1980 is very difficult, but also every point of image become very, very strange, if anything more modern, together with the programs. To understand different forms of the documented history become very, very difficult if you are looking for anything very precise. So sometimes you must change and look just for the simple things. To understand simple things sometimes is very, very difficult, but it's also very difficult to build better culture, especially together with the technology. To understand simple forms of the humans is very difficult, but also very hard to understand any forms of genetics or evolution in human beings. To understand human past is also very difficult, but also it's not easy to understand the future. To understand population, of course, it's very simple if we look from the body point of 1980, where medicine was not very evolved. For more and more evolution in medicine, of course, you need more tools, but that don't mean any more evolution from the body part. The body actually belongs to the Taoism and not so much to extreme productivity that women might have in mind or in their trends. Of course, there is also some sort of security together with different forms how to limit women's, but sometimes also the accounting security and how the man can build a better age, especially together with the investors, but also different forms of regulations. If you do not agree with me, of course you can build a better information and of course focus on whatever you like the most. But in 1980 everything was extremely difficult, especially in UK, but also in USA on any account. Of course Europe is also very important, but to understand different forms of the systems is also very, very difficult when it comes to the politics. Let's think about politics in 1980 and what it changed till modern time. Actually, not a lot. The banking is completely the same, and all the technology in the world did not change banking a lot. So people should actually be more aware of what is going on with simple forms of the service around the world and not so much local. To understand computers in the world, it's not simple, especially how to make them, but also to understand different forms of the charity. You should make the simple forms of the report also for politics and what you are doing. To understand different forms of the partnership, it's very important, but also together with different forms of coding, you can build a better accounts for the politics if they pay enough. Of course, if they not, they are some sort of criminals. To understand simple forms of the science together with Taoism, that's some sort of administration, but also not easy to lead any institute if you are building better and better accounts. To understand different association, it's not easy. And there are different candidates that you might see for the benefits of economics if you are working on basic health or just Taoism. To maintain simple forms of the health together with your employees, it's not simple, but it's also very important to understand simple forms of certifications, especially in Java microends, but also to understand simple forum of the knowledge, but also to understand scientific forums in life. To understand words, of course, also sometimes is very, very difficult, but also to understand scientific point of words and different forms of textbooks. To understand different forms of clubs is also important, but also some sort of science. The science in 1980 was actually very difficult, but also very difficult to understand different forms of the benefits for industry in science. Writing, relying, thinking only about science is actually very, very difficult, but also some sort of success. There are different forms of the style for the guide, of course, in different forms of the simple form advocacy, but also to understand different forms of the very, very difficult science that was in 1980 and how that one was actually better than modern science. To understand different forms of sedations together with medical book, it's not easy, especially together with pharmaceutical knowledge. But also pharmacology, also playing different forms of the role in life. The politics sometimes are not interested in any form of extra evolution, and they might not control any form of the medicine. For sure, you must use appropriate, simple form words for politics also. To understand different forms of the therapy is very important, but also the blood products if you are working in medicine or with my book, G and Tommy. Of course, you must know to understand different forms of the vaccine, which also described in my book as vacation, but also to understand simple forms of the therapy together with administration. To understand different forms of antibiotics is also important, but also to understand different forms of the cells. If you are working together in medicine, in 1980, of course, that was very difficult, but in modern times, sometimes nothing changed, especially not in Taoism. Contraceptions are a lot of used in modern time, but in 1980 there was not so much pills. To understand different forms of the methods women's use might be very violent and sometimes even incorrect if there is no doctor or Taoist. To understand different forms of the effects, it's also very important to understand different forms of formulations and also to understand different forms of the studies and methods. Not easy to understand science. 1980 is very difficult, but also there are different forms of the science together with the code. The code is actually very, very dangerous if you use too much science. Usually, it's very important to understand simple forms of the site, but also how those come together with different forms of the file, and to understand simple forms of original microends, which is extremely complex. To understand fashion of women inside microends might be very difficult because humans can also to some point configure their own fashion, especially in 1980. Sometimes it's also very important to understand different forms of the scripts, but also to understand different forms of the comments the humans have about you if you are a leader. Those might be extreme fiction or extremely unreal. Of course, there are different types of the code, but sometimes you could not use the code, but only the ethics if you are building a better world. It's very heavy code if you are only coding with a woman, so sometimes it's very important also to code with man groups. To understand different forms of the simple forms together with the code, it's very important, but also the feeding in different forms of the Facebooks. Of course, book and the face are two different things, and you should not mess that together because face is one thing and the book is the other thing. And of course, in my book, there is no faces. To understand simple forms in life, it's not always simple, but also sometimes the World Health Organization is helping people and scientists to understand different forms of the treats in world, but also to understand different forms of the nations. Of course, there is millions of classifications for diseases, but sometimes it's very important to understand simple forms together with the standards, also micro standards. To understand different forms together with the simple forms of the plants is also important because the plants actually build simple forms of foundations. Not easy to understand different forms of the philanthropies because the philanthropies are very, very difficult. Any kind of the philanthropies are extreme difficult, and those philanthropies might not do anything for anyone, and sometimes it's much better to understand simple forms and not too much philanthropy. If you want to do charity, probably it's the best to understand simple forms of the health together with Taoism and not too much mess together with community health. The community health might be very unhealthy and very in modern medicine, but that's not 1980 that I am describing it. To understand dentists, of course, it's not a simple subject, also described in a book as a simple forms of self-Taoism, but also to understand different forms of the walls. There is millions of different forms of walls that people do not use a lot. You can actually avoid 90% of different forms of the surgery with simple observation of self, but also to understand psychology of female and how everything begins for female in 1960 or even later. Of course, me is not perfect, and me also have a lot of discomfort to presenting different forms in the film, but also to presenting different forms of words. Words are actually difficult. Psychiatry is using very, very difficult words, and sometimes there is millions of mistakes in those psychiatric meanings. To understand depression in fashion sector, sometimes it's not easy at all. There is also the depression in technology or even training. To understand psychiatry is extremely complex if you are a Taoist or a simple nurse. To understand doctors, together with their degree, it's also not simple. And of course, everyone in technology should have some sort of interpretation about them. To understand or to practice simple forms in life is also very important, but also to understand different forms of clinics. Psychology is actually very difficult and it's not easy to understand if you are playing any instrument. Instruments can be very, very different, and of course, the environment in world is very, very different also. To build environments, it's not easy. For example, also the Minecraft builded simple forms of environments, and there are millions of other computer games that people are playing around the world. But do you think those are real environments? Those environments are just a fiction. To acquire better information, sometimes you must be a very good listener. Probably you should also be afraid of any sound, because there is a psychology that can also go against the sound or against human. To understand different forms of orientations is also very important, but also to understand different forms of information processing. Once you understand information processing, you can actually build better together with environment, but also together with banking. To diagnose banking, it's not always simple and it's some sort of disorder because bankers, all kind of bankers, they also have different forms of disorder together with them. To understand different forms of the community is 100% not easy. To also understand different forms of the behavior, it's also not easy. There is, of course, also psychology about anything ecological and how much that wrong could be. Or sometimes also most of the community it become extremely difficult if anything bipolar or political science. To understand public health is very difficult, but it's also very difficult to understand anything more social if you are working together with psychology or with the code. All kind of apps, they could be actually very corrupted if you do not use ethics. So the ethics in a code are actually part of me, but also very important. And that's exactly why you should restrict women in your company also. It's not easy to understand different forms of generate, different forms of the code together with different forms of the profiling together with file, but also to build better description for the world of profiles. Of course, there is also different forms of dependency, but also different forms of the build case, how to build a better profile, to understand different forms of the age, together with packs, but also paths, to build better local forums. Also, with the news in local environment is important. Sometimes you must look for very hard situation or film you can find on the web and then you can build a better compiler. And that's not always easy. Sometimes also making films, it's not easy to understand different forms of the value of debugging together with the code only coders might understand. Of course, in 1980, the coding was not very advanced, but it was just like some sort of the beginning. There are a lot of environments in 1980 that actually inspire me about different forms of configurations, but also about the compiler and how to build a better profiling to understand different forms of the buildings. Probably it's more an abstraction and fiction when it comes to the shape. To understand configuration together with sociology is extremely difficult. The community mental health would be extremely difficult in 1980, but sometimes even more and more complex when you come to modern world. Of course, my words are not perfect, and me also make a mistake sometimes, but on a basic level, anyone could understand what was my message on a simple form of psychology. If you are looking for anything more than simple, of course, you must turn on different type of community, but there what you find are hospitals and not anything advanced or not anything about advanced mental health for rich people. Usually, in public services for different forms of mental health, you only find poverty and extremely cheap B complex pills. But if you are looking for simple forms of the vitamins together with B, you must think about different forms of community also to understand different forms of survivors together with geography is also very complex if you are thinking from the point of the maps. But of course, sometimes better than all the evolution is just mental health. Mental health is very important anywhere in world you might go. The community in this world is extremely complex and it should never change. The humans are simply not able to change, and that's the problem of the community. The community mental health might be on extremely low level because it's want more and more and more, but me actually less. In 1980, that's very psychiatry, but also extreme fashion. The fashion, of course, is some sort of jail, but also some sort of simple form of the care for self. To understand better and better and better design, sometimes it's just not better in the function, and sometimes you should just build a more and more simple configuration for yourself and not too much dependency on other. To understand configurations values is also not simple, and there is a lot of elegance together with independency. To understand architecture, of course, it's described in a book, but also it evolved from the book design. To understand architecture, it's extremely unrelated to any form of the government, but it's actually more 1980 or more simple style. To understand fiction in the governments is actually very important. So you can also build a better configurations together with the code for different forms of politics or concurrency. To understand any forms of the currency is actually extremely difficult. Sometimes do not support politics if they do support a lot of wars, because that means the death for other people. To understand safety, sometimes you must just build a more and more simple code, which is of course not easy. There are different forms of the community, but also different forms of the service that you can do in life. Of course, there is also the mental health in communities, but also different forms of the settings you can actually use. To understand different forms of population in communities is also very important, but also to understand that it's very important to build simple forms of the life. Do not mess yourself together with the therapy that are centers because they are extremely difficult community and they are just half of the centers are extremely corrupted all over all cities. The mental health in the centers, in cities, is not my priority because there is a lot of sick people. But sometimes on psychiatry portals, you can also find more about that. There are a lot of mental disorders you might have as a leader, but every leader has some mental disorders. Not easy to explain that in hospitals or with different forms of the clinics. Some people even mention the climate change or what type of climate change could change in world. Of course, there are different forms of the status around the world, but also in America, there are different forms of the psychiatric organizations, and every coder is extremely confused when it comes to that. To understand different forms of the likies, it's not easy, but those likies actually contains different forms of disorders, and of course a lot of theory of different forms of the book history we make. To understand different forms of simple forms of the code, it's not easy, but also to understand different forms of the package together with the collection for the multi-language, actually, the languages are a little bit difficult because they come together with the culture. If you use like two language or five language, that's different than 25 language. And if you use thousands of languages around the world, of course, you might find me again in Africa, being poor with everyone else, but hey, the Linux is making us richer. To understand field microends is actually just evolution of the Linux. But of course, it also beats with the algorithms in 1980 if anything go wrong in more modern time. Not easy to understand the whole film, and sometimes some films are extremely difficult and also looks like a day but nothing more than that. Sometimes your day is only a film or some sort of text conversation. To understand different forms of the skills together with the object of D also can come together with the Java for different forms of the cPanels or platforms. Of course, also the JavaScript is also important, but not too much liking it unless you are building the portal together with the different forms of the very safe buttons. There are different forms of the supports that people are making in their life, but the banks they are not using a lot of support for people. Of course, there are also the programs that can replace banks, but that will never happen because the banks are extremely political. To understand different forms of the login, it's also very difficult. And of course, you can look on my information available here, but you will not find anything specific if you are not smart. For the smart people, of course, they might find a lot of difficult informations, and also that might serve them for more years to become better persons. To understand different forms of the brain and the logos is also not simple, but also the logos, of course, are different forms of the symbols for studio, but also the graphics. To understand different forms of the logos actually might be partly the design of the female fashion or even female behavior.
No go Dan.
Nan.
Știi că e pe